Alrighty, good evening, everyone. This is meteorologist Timmy Albertson. Welcome to tonight's weather chat. Hey, we're going to make this one kind of a quick one, as it's pretty quiet right now across the U.S., well, all things considered. Not necessarily seeing too much in the way of active weather. Now, on Friday, we did a video about the Edmund Fitzgerald. Of course, then we had some technical issues of trying to upload that, not only on Friday, but also over the weekend. So, because I had promised that, I do want to go ahead and talk a little bit about that really quickly here. Even though the anniversary was 3 days ago of its sinking, well, we'll talk about it tonight anyway, just given the fact that it's so quiet. All right, everyone, are you ready for it? Let's talk about it here really quickly. So we're going to talk about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Now, for those of you who haven't grown up around the Great Lakes region and seen freighters before, they are rather impressive. They're very large boats. And growing up around the Great Lakes myself, these are kind of a common sight, especially up around Lake Erie, but also up around Lake Superior, around where I live right now. Interestingly enough, the Edmund Fitzgerald, when it was built, was at the time was the largest freighter on the Great Lakes until a couple years later when another freighter was like 1 foot longer. But either way, this boat was over 700 feet long. Actually, I think it was like 780 feet long. What made the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald a little bit interesting was kind of the suddenness of its sinking. Now, unlike the Andrea Gale, when we talked about the perfect storm a couple weeks ago, how it was out in the middle of the ocean. It wasn't really clear exactly when it sank or where exactly it sank. The Edmund Fitzgerald, we know pretty much what was happening leading up to the sinking. In the terms of hours ahead of time, hours. This boat was in communication with some of the surrounding boats around them, which were also going through some of the same weather conditions across Lake Superior. Unlike the Andrea Gale, which, sank out in the middle of the ocean and we still really haven't found it yet, the Edmund Fitzgerald, they found the wreckage of that, a couple days later at the time using sonar. So this one is very interesting, though, because like I said, despite how much we know about it, it was those final few moments that kind of shrouded in mystery. Now, the Edmund Fitzgerald got a lot of help in pop music. Gordon Lightfoot wrote a song about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald that became a very well-known hit. So that also kind of helped to popularize the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But the Great Lakes are no stranger to shipwrecks. As a matter of fact, since Europeans have been sailing it, there's been at least 6,000 shipwrecks. And here's the map I have, albeit I don't have it up on the screen here, but these are just Lake Superiors. You can see quite a bit. All right, so let's talk about the weather that surrounded the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So we got to go all the way back, folks, to 1975, all right? And basically what we saw going on is around the time where, what would have been November 8th, Saturday Night Live. For those of you who don't know, Saturday Night Live started in 1975. It was on its 4th episode, the Saturday before all this happened. And that would have been the episode with Candice Bergen. That would have been the Land Shark episode. All right, anyways, let's go ahead here, folks, though, and take a look at the weather map. Now, what was interesting is that going into the couple days before this, it was actually some warm weather out across parts of the upper part of the Midwest and even more so across the East Coast. They have this area of high pressure off the Atlantic coast, again, kind of helping to bring in a little bit of a southerly breeze. There was this cold front that did try to push through, but it wasn't a very strong one. And then behind it, we had this little kind of a clipper type of low pressure that was quickly racing its way out of the Canadian prairies, and that did help to actually kind of drop those temperatures back down a little bit. But still, it was pretty quiet when the Edmund Fitzgerald had actually made its way into Superior, Wisconsin to pick up 26,000 tons of tassonite pellets to take all the way back to around my home area. It was en route to Detroit. The Edmund Fitzgerald, as a side note, had a couple of nicknames. One of them was the Toledo Express, as it often docked itself over in Toledo, Ohio, which is pretty much right next to where I'm from. All right, so let's go ahead, folks, and fast forward now to the next day. So we take a look at the weather map here on the Sunday, November 9th. And by this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald was already on its way, leaving Superior and going out into the open waters of Lake Superior. Now, what's interesting about this is by this point, if we take a look at the weather map here, forecasters pretty much already had an idea that there was probably going to be a strong area of low pressure tracking around that area. As a matter of fact, the official forecast at the time had this area of low pressure down here passing just to the south of Lake Superior, so most likely probably crossing somewhere up across, the northern part of the lower peninsula of Michigan. But regardless of the fact, it was still expected to be very breezy. It was still expected to be very windy, and so gale warnings were put up for all of Lake Superior. Now, if you're the Edmund Fitzgerald, this is nothing unusual. And if you're a forecaster, this is nothing unusual. And if you live around the Great Lakes, this is nothing unusual, especially during the month of November. Hence why it had its own nickname, the Gales of November. All right, so they had a little bit of a plan. So also leaving Minnesota, well, Superior, Wisconsin is where the Edmund Fitzgerald came out of, but there was another boat right behind it called the Anderson that also departed on the same day from Minnesota, and both of those two boats were in communication with each other, and with the gale warning that was put out, it was assumed that the best course would be to take it not through the center part of the lake, but maybe going a bit more to the north and using Canada here effectively as a shield against the wind. So again, kind of standard procedure. So what ended up happening though? Well, this was a pretty decent sized low pressure. We can already see it here in Kansas getting itself organized here. And by this point, like I said, things were quiet, but then the weather quickly started to, to use the term that most people would use, deteriorate across the Great Lakes, mainly the northern Great Lakes. We're talking starting to get some winds picking up now, starting to get some precipitation, and that would have been going into the evening hours as this area of low pressure began to make its way more to the north and to the east. This is an old weather map, folks. This is from 1975, so again, not as high resolution, and we certainly don't have much in the way of radar during this time. The radar was around, don't get me wrong, just don't have access to as many of those images as we like. Regardless, though, precipitation indicated here by this gray on these surface maps did kind of extend ahead of that, which is what we'd expect with these low pressures. So let's go ahead, folks, and talk about what happened on the overnight hours. That low pressure really began to intensify, and it became very clear that this storm will probably pass right over Lake Superior. How close to Lake Superior, you ask? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the weather map the morning of November 10th. Whoop, let me go ahead and pull it up here so you guys can see it. All right, there we go. That's a pretty decent sized low pressure. This would have been the morning of November 10th. So by this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald had already been getting knocked around by high waves, around, 20 feet or so, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for Lake Superior, it's pretty decent size height. Not only that, but getting hit with some pretty decent winds around 50 to even 60 miles an hour. So we take a look here at the pressure gradient. We can see that the pressure gradient is very tight here on the back side of this, which is generally where we'd expect to see that anyway with these areas of low pressure. So we have this strong low pressure that has now tracked its way a little bit more to the north, but forecasters did kind of catch that earlier in the overnight hours and expected it was going to pass right over the center of Lake Superior. By this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald was right around this area. The area of low pressure, the center of it, passed over, or at least very nearby to where the Edmund Fitzgerald was, and the conditions actually kind of slightly improved, was the term that most people would use. The winds did kind of taper down a little bit, but by the time they got to the afternoon, that quickly changed, and those winds, which had been northeasterly, suddenly became northwesterly. All right, so talk about northwesterly winds here, and you might be asking yourself, why is that important in this situation? Because now we're going to use our imagination here a little bit as I explain this part to you. So, by the late afternoon hours, the winds were easily gusting 50, 60 miles an hour across Lake Superior. In fact, there were some observations that were even a little bit higher. And interestingly, the boat that was right behind the Edmund Fitzgerald by a couple of miles, the Anderson, was very good at keeping track of some of the wind speeds that it was kind of recording and that it was getting. And one of them was at least somewhat unofficial, the 90-mile-an-hour wind gust not too far away from the Sioux Locks there. So all things considered, it was a very, very windy type of setup here. And again, we're talking about open water, so there's not as much friction for that wind when it does come down. But here's the other thing, too. Let's talk about waves for a moment. Now, when we talk about lake effect snow, we talk about something called fetch, which is the kind of the elongated part of the lake, the longest stretch from end to end. In this case, for Lake Superior, you could argue that it's from basically near Thunder Bay all the way down to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Okay, so this area right here. As this low pressure moved its way into Ontario during the afternoon, the winds became northwesterly. Again, remember, the airflow around an area of low pressure is counterclockwise for the most part. And, well, it is counterclockwise. Sometimes the direction varies a few degrees based on friction, but you get the idea. All right, so it's a counterclockwise wind flow. So now we got that wind coming off the northwest as that low pressure moves into Canada. So those winds are traveling over the open waters of Lake Superior for a good amount of time. That allows those waves to be even a little bit more enhanced during the late afternoon hours. Now, for those of you who've never been up here, the sun sets this time of the year around sets about 4:45, so it does start getting dark a little bit earlier, or technically doesn't get dark until a little bit after that, but obviously twilight. Twilight, that's the word I was looking for, twilight. All right, so visibility, or the daylight started to decrease, and they got hit with a snow squall. Most likely some of this activity here you see on the backside as it was going over the lake swung its way over Lake Superior because it was snowing. And the Anderson did report that. In fact, it was snowing so heavily the visibility dropped. And all of a sudden, the Anderson, who had been a few miles behind the Edmund Fitzgerald, suddenly couldn't see its lights anymore. And by the time it got to about 7 p.m. or so is when it really just kind of disappeared from view. Thus the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So you have a boat that had been pretty much observing, and the Edmund Fitzgerald had some other problems that were going on. It was really getting knocked around pretty much. And so we're going to kind of deviate slightly from the weather thing, but we're not going to go too much into detail about this. But if you want to know more about it, there's plenty of reports, exactly the final moments kind of leading up to the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But one thing that happened is that the charts that they were using on the Edmund Fitzgerald turned out to be slightly inaccurate. And one of the things was there was a little bit of a shallow part of the lake that on the map that the Edmund Fitzgerald would have had was denoted to be a mile further to the west than it actually was, which means it was closer. So the Edmund Fitzgerald was actually trying to work its way around that kind of shallow part. So there is some thinking that the Edmund Fitzgerald may have actually possibly run aground briefly, might have, but it wouldn't have known it given the high waves and everything. So that might have helped to maybe lead to some flooding. Again, still not exactly entirely certain. The other thing that could have happened with the Edmund Fitzgerald is that it broke in half, which we know it did do, but exactly what caused that is a little uncertain. The controversial one is that the hatches that, they poured the iron ore into this big boat here, folks, and you can't see it on this picture, but right here in the middle, there are these little hatches, open them up, and that's where they dumped everything in. So there is a controversial explanation that those might not have been closed properly, thus allowing water to get in as the waves splashed over. Again, so there's a couple of theories, but one interesting one that might have precipitated the Edmund Fitzgerald to finally sinking was the Anderson had been hit a few minutes before by 2 to 3 waves that were at least 35 feet tall. Now, again, doesn't sound like a lot, but that's enough, especially when you're dealing with a long boat like that. The amount of stress is quite a bit on that. So the Anderson got hit with these 3 waves. And the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is already having a little bit of a list, it had already reported that it was listing, which means it was not floating straight. It was kind of tilted a little bit, had lost its radar and had lost a couple of other things. It really was not in the best of conditions and may have been taking on water through either the hatchways or possibly from something underneath if it possibly ran aground on that shoal. But uh, regardless, the time that it would have taken those three waves, known as a Three Sisters type of setup for those of you around Lake Superior, kind of rogue waves, more or less, the time that those hit the Anderson to the time when the Anderson could no longer see the Andrea Gale would have kind of lined up. So it's possible that the final, thing that put the Andrea Gale, I keep saying Andrea Gale, the Edmund Fitzgerald, the final thing that kept the Edmund Fitzgerald, that might have made the Edmund Fitzgerald sink was possibly those three rogue waves that came just right back to back with each other and, could have just overwhelmed the boat, caused it to either, to effectively, sink. Exactly how it goes into some physics debates if you really wanted to go that route on stressors and fractures of boats or, whether it hit the, there's a lot that goes into it. So, as mentioned, the Edmund Fitzgerald did not sink that far out. Believe it or not, if you actually take a look at here on a map, this is where it sank, just across the border into Canada. There you go. So it was actually trying to make it into here, an area that would have been a bit more protected. It probably could have covered that ground in about an hour, maybe in a little over an hour or so. And then, of course, through the evening and overnight, the conditions did begin to lessen up a little bit. And by the following day, it was pretty quiet. So, unlike the perfect storm, which hung around the Atlantic coast for a couple of days, this was a very quick moving system, but still a strong one nonetheless. So, was it really an unusual weather system? Probably not. As a matter of fact, these are not that unheard of, especially this time of the year up in the upper Midwest and upper part of the Great Lakes. But it might have been one of those things where even though the system itself might not have been unusual, it could have been one of those weird situations where just enough, just enough things clicked together as that system was moving its way across, the Great Lakes region that could have set up the conditions for a very rough time. Now, again, as mentioned, the Anderson, which was right behind the Edmund Fitzgerald, pretty much this entire time did not sink. But then again, it did not lose its radar. And a couple of other things. So the Edmund Fitzgerald, again, had some problems. It did not. It was just interesting. It did not handle the storm quite as well. And the captain even said it was the worst, the worst weather he'd ever had to sail through. So pretty interesting when you think about it. And again, you got to remember, folks, we talk about, like, let me give you an analogy. An F5 tornado is not unheard of, okay? But if it runs over a certain area, it could be very different not that far away. You know what I mean? So, probably not the best example to use a tornado when we're talking about an extratropical low, but regardless of the fact, you get what I'm saying. So, it's just very interesting how that shaped up to be. So that is the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, at least in terms of the weather. And like I said, the Coast Guard did an extensive report on about it that came out a couple years after the sinking and everything. Though again, some of its findings were considered controversial, especially among the freighting industry related to the hatchways. And there's been additional investigation. As I said, they know where it is. They found it. It is broken in half, 500 feet below Lake Superior. So it's not like some other shipwrecks where we just don't know where they are, or there's nothing left, or, again, this one was very unique because, like I said, the Edmund Fitzgerald wreck was very unique. I don't want to say very unique, but was, very interesting because it was such a large boat. I mean, this was a large, large boat, folks. This is 780 feet long. All right, that is a long boat. At that rate, you might as well just be all of Lake Superior. So it was a very large boat. Had 20, almost 20 years of service under its belt. So it wasn't like it was a brand new boat like the Titanic would have been. This boat had been, plenty used. The crew was very experienced, including the captain, who had been sailing for 40 plus years. But, it was in communication with other boats around the area, and suddenly it just disappeared. And it did so kind of at the end of the storm, more or less. And by end, I mean, there was probably the peak intensity was probably just past peak intensity, because by that point the low was beginning to move pretty far away. So very interesting. The Coast Guard was out looking for it, within a couple of hours, and nothing was ever found of it except for some empty lifeboats and some empty life jackets. That's about it, really. So that could also lead to the theory, for those of you who like shipwrecks, that whatever it was happened very quickly. Uh, no time to really respond to it. So that is the weather around the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Fun fact, like I said, the crew, there's only 29 people on the crew. Uh, Half of them were from Toledo, which is around where I grew up, and then the other half lived up around the area that I am in now, which is up around Duluth. So it's always found that very interesting, the kind of the odds of that. That the crew was pretty much split 50-50 between those two cities, which I'm incredibly familiar with. Not only that, but the system that did sink the Edmund Fitzgerald was a very windy one, and it did. You can look back, and that's what I forgot to pull up was the newspaper archives from down around Toledo, because they did see some very gusty winds that did cause some power outages down there. But that was pretty much the main thing for them was breezy conditions, which is not unusual in the Midwest. So, folks, that is the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Like I said, that's just the weather part of it. We'll stay away kind of from a lot of the physics parts of it. Tomorrow, if the weather is quiet, we are going to talk about the Veterans Day Trento outbreak of 2002 that occurred, that hit Ohio, and I remember that one very, very well, including a massive F4 tornado that hit a town nearby where I'm from, as well as tornadoes across parts of the Deep South from that same outbreak. So we'll talk a little bit about the weather surrounding that tornado outbreak. Again, that would have been back in 2002. So if you want to look ahead study ahead, Veterans Day weekend tornado outbreak 2002. That's what we're going to take a look at tomorrow. At least the weather, the weather setup part of it, we'll take a little bit of a look at. So, that in mind, everyone, I hope you all have a good rest of your evening. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you back here tomorrow evening. Take care, everyone.